Good afternoon, everybody. This is Anne Lund with the Haunted and Waiting podcast. Of course, I want to start off, as always, thanking Gary from the Eye Opener Society for allowing me to present this story for this episode. And what is this episode? Well, I'm going to call it True Ghost Stories and Crisis Apparitions, when loved ones come to say goodbye. So, what is a crisis apparition? Well, they're very common, and they're not your typical ghosts, but they're the ones that seem to be very, very interesting because they're very hard to dispute. So let me start with a situation that I had when I went to Gettysburg years ago. And as you know, Gettysburg has got its fair share of ghosts. And this story actually was told to me by a tour guide, and I do remember the story vividly. I could not find it online, but when I tell the story, you'll understand how it can relate to other stories that are similar, that are about these crisis apparitions. So here I was on a tour, and the gentleman holding the tour had told us that there was this story about I guess it was a sergeant in the Army during the Civil War. And he apparently had this soldier that was working under him that was kind of popular and known amongst the people at the time. And it was his favorite soldier, I should say. They were nowhere near each other, however. This soldier was fighting in battle somewhere in Gettysburg, and this captain or sergeant, whatever, was somewhere else in Gettysburg. They were nowhere near each other. And at some point, he walked into this room, and he saw this soldier standing there. Struck him as kind of odd because, again, this soldier was supposedly fighting, and what was he doing in this area of Gettysburg? So they looked at each other. He said nothing to him, and then he just walked out of the room. The captain walked out, followed him, wanted to know what he was doing there, or did he need any help? But when he got out of the room, as you can expect, this soldier was missing. It's gone, as if he just disappeared, vanished in thin air. Now, here's what a crisis apparition is, and you'll understand in a second. Later that day, he found out that this soldier had died. He had died actually around the same time he had seen him, but in a totally different area of Gettysburg. So clearly it couldn't have been him, which leads to the definition of a crisis apparition. Basically, it's a ghost that comes to say goodbye. So in this particular instance, that's what happened. The soldier had come to say goodbye to his sergeant or captain or what have you. These kinds of things, I feel, are proof that there are ghosts, because how could he have known that he was going to pass? And yet there he was. We also hear these stories lots of times with mothers and children. We all know that mothers form strong bonds with their children. And it's a trope, it's a common trope that we hear in crime shows all the time. When a mother says that she saw her child in the middle of the night, maybe came to her bedside, or maybe came in a dream. And at that very moment, the mother would know that her child had passed, whether by an accident, some nefarious act, maybe an illness. And we hear these all the time. And sure enough, usually that's what happens. A dear neighbor of mine had told me this story. I have very good memory for these stories. Even when they don't happen to me, I just remember them. This particular story happened in the 60s. She was from Ireland, and Ireland has its fair share of ghost stories. It's a very popular thing to talk about there. When you're in Ireland, everybody seems to have a ghost story in their family, and this was the one that she shared with me. She had been sleeping, and she awoke again for some reason. These things happen a lot of times at night, and she was awoken in the middle of the night. And when she looked up, her older brother was sitting on her bed. She told me at that time she was in her early tweens. I want to say maybe 12 or 13. And her older brother was in his early 20s. He had gone out, what people in their 20s do, maybe at a party, what was it? But he had been drinking and he had gone out. And she just thought that he had come home early and that he had sat on her bed, to say goodbye. But once again, he said nothing to her. He just sat there, looked at her, and then he got up and walked out. She went to sleep not thinking anything of it. And the next day, her brother was nowhere to be seen. and actually the day after he had been missing for a good 2 days. Long story short, they actually found him lying in a ditch. He had been hit by a car, and he had actually passed away 2 days earlier. Same time that he paid her a visit. Classic crisis apparition, as if to say, I'm leaving and I just want to say goodbye. And for whatever reason, ghosts don't give a lot of reasons, don't talk much, but they have to let their presence known. And this is what happened with her, and she swears that it was her brother. So, but it's not always a ghostly apparition. Sometimes it's just an item. Now, this happened to me firsthand. And it was the moment that I knew that a great aunt of mine had passed before anybody had told me. When I was very young, she had given me this very dainty necklace, very thin gold chain, very, very thin, with a gold heart at the tip of it. And it was a beautiful, beautiful necklace. The only problem is I was young when she gave it to me. I want to say I was about 5. And it was very dainty. And I basically lost it. Couldn't find it. And we all thought, my mother, of course, was very angry that I had lost it, was because the chain was so thin that it must have snapped. And I lost it in school, playground, what have you. It was just gone. So for years, I was not able to find this necklace. And I just kind of forgot about it. We're going to fast forward now. It must have been about 20 years later, maybe even 30 years later. Well, let's say 20. I was cleaning out a closet, totally different house. Actually, this was 2 houses later. And I was looking for a belt, as it could be, I remember. And I picked up the belt and I went to put it on. And when I went to put it on, something fell on the floor. And I went, I wonder what that is. And when I went to the floor, I found out that it was the necklace. It somehow got into my stuff with my belts, and whatever reason, there it was. So I picked it up, and it still had the chain. The chain was not broken, and couldn't figure it out. It was just the weirdest thing. I don't know how it got there. Lo and behold, the very next day, I get a call from my mother to tell me that my aunt had passed the day before. So another example of a crisis apparition. I don't know if anything like that has ever happened to you. I am doing research on items that come to us through the dead as messages or symbols. If you have any, I really would appreciate you sharing with them. And at the end of this podcast, I'll give some information on how you could do that. So a similar story was a very good friend of mine had told me that she smelled her father's cigar the moment he died in hospice. So he was in hospice. She was home. She gets this strong smell, scent of cigar, and finds out, I don't know if it was a day later, the next, probably the same day, actually, it was her father, the very moment that her father had passed, even before a phone call. Kind of strange. So coincidence or something beyond what we understand? So what do you think? Can spirits come back one last time? Well, let's look at some scientific historical accounts on crisis apparitions. And I want to talk about Lincoln because Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated, as you know, in 1865, there are many, many stories about Abraham Lincoln visiting the White House and the place where he had died at the theater. But a lot of people don't know this, but hours before Abraham Lincoln was shot, Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, saw his ghost enter their bedroom. And actually, I don't think it was before he was shot. I think it was when he was shot. And basically, it was the same thing. He just looked at her. She was reported to have asked him, what's wrong? But he simply stood there, and didn't speak, which again is the case. I don't know why they don't communicate like that. It's like they have to let themselves be seen. But then other than that, they don't say much more. And that was the case with Lincoln. So that same night, some of Lincoln's closest associates, including at the time the Secretary of War, claimed that they had felt his presence, in the area, like they had a strong sense that he was there. So, and lo and behold, he had died the day that she had seen his ghost. So again, another example of a crisis apparition. So Mary Todd Lincoln is no stranger to the paranormal, actually. Our little White House ghost hunter had experienced other crisis apparitions a year earlier. Many people don't know that, but her son, Willie, so Lincoln passed away, was assassinated in 1865, but her son Willie died in 1862 of typhoid fever, which was common at the time. And the mother, Mary Todd Lincoln, will swear to it, that he also visited her that night. And again, standing at the foot of her bed, smiling. So that is a story. Didn't say anything, but just stood but he was dead. So interesting. I don't know why they like to visit bedsides. It's hard to tell, but it seems to happen a lot. So she was also known, Mrs. Lincoln, to have held many seances at the White House, desperate to see her son again, but I'm not sure it ever happened again. So you can look that up. I will post the link to that story on my blog later on. So let's talk about other strange encounters from the modern world. I went through my Facebook followers to share some stories. I asked them to share some stories, and I got a bunch. But a few were specifically tied into crisis apparitions. So some of them I did not share because they did not have to do with a crisis apparition, somebody coming to tell you that they had died. But I did get two, and I'm going to share one right now. For those of you that follow the Eye Opener Society, Sunset Child has a few podcasts there. I strongly recommend that you watch or listen to her podcast. I'll share her link to that as well as her TikTok page and her Facebook page in the blog. But she has a very interesting way of looking at things. She looks at timelines, alternate realities. It's pretty amazing. She thinks about things I've never even considered. We're going to have a podcast with her in a couple of weeks where she is interpreting one of my ghost stories as a timeline shift. And I had never thought about it that way, but the more she explained it to me, the more I kind of agree with her. So please stay with us. We're going to share that story in a couple of weeks. It's very interesting. It's an interesting, true story. But let me tell you about her story that she told me. And this, I want to say, happened about 5 years ago. She had been babysitting for her niece, who I want to say was between 1 and 2 years old. And this particular niece was very close to her great grandfather. So not grandfather, but great grandfather, who at the time was in hospice care. Now, this was a great grandfather on the other side of the family. So Sunset Child was not familiar with this gentleman. This child was, the grandfather was on the other side of the family. So she really didn't know much about him other than that he was really sick and he was in hospice care at the time. So as she was babysitting, this little girl, for some reason, was staring at the ceiling. And she couldn't figure out what it was, and she was fixated. And then all of a sudden, she lifted up her arms towards the ceiling and said one word. You guessed it, Grandpa. And then with her hands opening and closing as if she wanted to be lifted, and her eyes were set straight ahead up as if towards the ceiling. And again, the only word, Grandpa. And lo and behold, later that night, after she had gone home, the family receives a call that the great-grandfather had passed away. So had she sensed his departure? Was it a psychic thing on the child's part, or did he truly come to say goodbye? I kind of struggle with that. Is it a psychic thing, or is it the actual apparition, the actual person? I think it's more the ghost. If you disagree and you think it's just the child was psychic or these people are psychic, like Mary Todd Lincoln, I'd love to hear what you think and why. Okay, so just comment below. So let's go into one more story. And we're going to talk about the ghost of Lord Brougham. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's Brougham. So I'm going to say Brougham. And this story comes from 1825, and it comes from a book called Historic Ghosts and Ghost Hunters. It's an old book that was published in 1908, and I found this article. I thought it was really, really, really interesting and kind of substantiates the crisis ghost theory. Okay, so the story begins with this man, again, Henry Brougham. They later called him Lord Brougham, who, when he was in college, in 1825, he had a friend, this really close friend of his, and they used to argue a lot about life after death, what happens after you die, religion, all these deep kinds of thoughts. And from what I can see when I read the chapter, it seemed like Lord Brougham was against it, not believed it, whereas his friend was very much believing ghosts in the afterlife. So, but this debate apparently was one that they would have in college all the time. Okay. So, to put their beliefs to the test, the friend, or the two of them, swore that whoever would pass away first would try to return and prove to the other that there was this afterlife. And please stay with me because I'm going to get to the Harry Houdini story later on, which is very similar to this. Okay. So they made this pact. Whoever dies first, I'm going to come tell you, yes, there's life after death and there's ghosts. Or if you don't hear from me, that means there's not. So life went on for the two friends, and eventually they lost touch, as a lot of times college friends do. But years later, it was kind of hard to tell from the book when this was, but let's say it was 10 years later. It was much later where he had lost touch. This Lord Braham was taking a bath. And so there he was in the bath, just taking a bath, doing his thing. And all of a sudden he turns around, and sitting in a chair right in front of him was his friend. Okay. Three-dimensional, was explained as being as if he was still alive. But this sight was so scary to Lord Braham that he fainted. He got out of the tub, apparently he fainted, hit his head, and they found him there on the floor. When he woke up, he remembered everything, but he reasoned that this had just been a dream, okay, or a trick of his mind. After all, he himself dismissed anything supernatural, so he didn't believe it to begin with. So it kind of makes sense that he would think that, being a non-believer, taking a bath, maybe he was thinking of his friend and fell, and then when he came to, he didn't actually see the friend, but when he had passed out in his dream, he had seen the friend. So that was what he truly believed. But no matter how hard he tried to forget this vision or kick it out of his head, he couldn't. And being a skeptic, he refused to kind of share the story too much, but it seems like he did a couple of research on ghosts and came to the conclusion that maybe it was more psychological than paranormal. But here's where the story gets weird. It was 60 years later when he was looking at his journals, and he had been documenting all this stuff about just the research he had done, when he made a chilling discovery, because he had found out that through news that the day that he recorded that incident was the exact same day that his friend had died, miles and miles away. Now remember, he lost touch with this friend. So how could it be the exact same date of the vision, the same date that his friend had died? I mean, that is very odd. And if anything would convince you that that's a crisis apparition and not something to do with, emotions, that would be it. Or, like I said before, maybe he was just psychic and he sensed it. So let's talk about this Houdini pack. Okay. I hate to be a Debbie Downer for this one. For any Houdini lovers, this story is pretty amazing, and I will share again a link on my blog. So Houdini and his wife Bess had made a pact similar to our Lord Braham, that whoever died first, okay, would try to contact the other, but it would be done through a code. I guess they did the code thinking that nobody else could fool them, right? Like they would just know this code. It wouldn't be like a neighbor or a friend could pretend to be the other and give a message. It was a secret code that the only two knew. And the whole thing is they did acknowledge the fact that ghosts sometimes don't come when they're supposed to. So they basically said they gave themselves a 10-year cycle. That if they didn't contact each other 10 years after the death, then the pact was broken. There was no such thing as life after death, no such thing as ghosts. So the code with his wife was pretty ingenious, and here was the code. Okay. Roosevelt, followed by answer, tell, pray, answer, look, tell, answer, tell. So again, Roosevelt, answer, tell, pray, answer, look, tell, answer, tell. Basically, the code spelled believe. Okay. So according to the records, Harry Houdini made this pact with his wife. And again, it was a 10-year pact. But apparently, Houdini, who died first, never contacted his wife. So Bess actively attended many seances over the 10 years, held with tons of mediums, hoping to get this message from her husband using this code, hoping that maybe someone psychic would receive this code. But it never happened. So sadly, um, it didn't happen. And it was recorded that after 10 years, Bess finally said, and this is the quote, Houdini did not come back. And I think it was reported in a newspaper. Very sad because I think everybody at the time was waiting for that. So, I'm going to end my podcast today with something funny, with a twist. And again, take it with a grain of salt, take it with the truth. I do believe this to be a true story. A Facebook friend of mine named Maria, who is a gifted medium. I will share her link in my blog if you're interested in contacting her. Like I said, she is a medium. And to this end, here's proof that ghostly visits aren't always eerie. They can be downright awkward. Sometimes, in this case, I think funny. So, like I said, Maria is a gifted medium who interacts with the dead quite often. However, as is often the case, close friends and family can be the greatest skeptics. I know with my situation, I purposely do not tell my family a lot of the things I see or hear because they'll either poke fun at me, think I'm making it up. So I just don't do it. And I think in her situation, although I haven't had a lot of conversation with her about this, it seems like her father was no exception, that maybe did not necessarily believe she had this gift. So, moving forward, her father had been in hospice care for some time, and she was blessed to have been there at the moment that he died. So here he is, he passes away, she's there. And she had some visions there as well prior to that. But I want to share that in a different podcast, which is a totally interesting story. But she was there the moment he passed. And immediately after he passed, she found herself with this urgency to run to the restroom. I guess she was spending all this time at the deathbed. Maybe she didn't want to leave while he was alive. So she just had to run to the bathroom. So overwhelmed, she rushed to the bathroom. So here she is at the stall. And as she sat there, lost in thought, she kind of looks up and there was her father. Shocked, with her pants half down, she screamed, "Dad!" And his ghostly reply, "This will kill you." He said, and I quote, "I guess you really can do this." So even in the afterlife, humor still exists. So I hope you like my stories. I hope you like my podcast. What do you think? Are these visitations, or is it all in the mind? I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below or on social media. If you love eerie encounters, subscribe here at Podbeam and leave a review. It helps more than you know. You can also find me if you like my content here at the Eye Opener Society on Podbeam or on YouTube. You can also find me on my Facebook group, which is also called Haunted and Waiting. And there you can interact with other ghost enthusiasts. Or you can also find me on my blog, and you guessed it, also called Haunted and Waiting. So technically, hauntedandwaiting.blog, where I will post a transcript to this as well as my other shows and other articles and true stories. And you can also find links to all the resources and information that I mentioned here in this podcast. So, my ghostly friends, until next time, be vigilant, keep your eyes open, and don't discount what makes no sense. It may make more sense than you think. Remember, you also may be haunted and waiting. Until next time, friends.